Hello, today we are going to be talking about generative linguistics and cognitive psychology. Generative linguistics was first proposed by Noam Chomsky, who suggested that us, as humans, are hardwired or genetically predisposed for language learning. He also suggests that part of that hardwiring includes universal or generative grammar, general rules that all languages follow. In one interview, he describes language as a biologically determined, rich framework. For example, all languages have verbs and nouns, and they make a distinction between the two. These grammar patterns help language learners and allow us to generate sentences or structures. Understanding the similarities and differences of the grammar between languages can be utilized when learning a second language. Cognitive psychology, according to the textbook from class, Principles of Language Learning and Teaching by H. Douglas Brown, as well as the American Psychology Association's Dictionary of Psychology, is divergent from previously prominent behaviorist theories, in that it focuses more heavily on explanatory processes of psychology. It focuses on mental processes, including, as explained by the APA Dictionary of Psychology, perceiving, attending, thinking, languages, and memory, as well as the operation of these processes. Cognitive psychology moves past exploring what is happening and into examining and questioning why it is happening. As it relates to language, cognitive psychology can help us understand the processes at work when learning and manipulating a language. For example, it can help us understand the processing that allows us to recognize words, understand sentence structure, remember vocabulary, and produce speech, and further, how we can begin to use these abilities to manipulate language. Putting these two concepts, generative linguistics and cognitive psychology, together can allow us to think deeper about which learning strategies will be the most efficient and why. Through our presentation, we will explain the history of generative linguistics and cognitive psychology, including its significance in different time periods and the prominent figures that defined the two theories. We also explain strengths and weaknesses of both generative linguistics and cognitive psychology. Additionally, we will provide possible activities to utilize when learning or teaching languages. These are supported by our theories. We will conclude with an in-depth analysis of the two theories, as well as possible theories that critique or contradict generative linguistics and or cognitive psychology. Thank you for listening.
Our slide begins with the cognitive revolution, a pivotal shift that began emerging in the 1950s. This movement was a direct response to the mid-20th century's dominant theory, behaviorism. Behaviorists focused on what was observable, the external stimulus and the response, while cognitive psychologists were more interested in the unobservable, internal processes of the mind. A key figure in the transition was George Miller, who highlighted several areas that helped cognitive science develop. Among the most important are the use of scientific methods to test mental processes in controlled settings, the idea of mediation and information processing, or treating the human mind as a system much like a computer, the concept of innate, the natural ability to learn a language, and finally the modularity of the mind, the idea that our brain has distinct parts that work together to create thoughts. Because of this revolution, the cognitive approach surpassed behaviorism throughout the 1980s and 90s, becoming the most prominent line of research in the psychology world today. Here we are introduced to the prominent figures who drove the cognitive revolution, starting with generative transformational linguistics. The most important figure here is Noam Chomsky, one of the main influences behind the movement. He introduced universal grammar and successfully challenged the dominant theory of behaviorism with his work. We also note Zelig Harris, Chomsky's mentor, whose work on transformation grammar influenced Chomsky's own ideas. Moving to cognitive psychology, we have several giants. Jean Piaget is well known for his ideas on how children develop through 4 distinct stages of intellectual development. Ulrich Nesser, often called the father of cognitive psychology, formally named and defined the field. We again see Noam Chomsky, who challenged behaviorist B.F. Skinner by arguing that language is far too complex to be explained purely by physical rewards and punishment. George Miller, a key figure from our last slide, helped launch the movement and is famous for his finding that working memory holds roughly the magic number 7 plus or minus 2 pieces of information. Finally, Jerome Bruner co-authored a foundational study that helped establish the Harvard Center for Cognitive Studies in the 1960s. Together, these figures established the framework for modern cognitive science.
My name is Christy, and I will be going over the strengths and weaknesses of generative linguistics and cognitive psychology. First, we will start with generative linguistics. As I was exploring Beyond Brown, I came across Forlesi's side-by-side comparison of both generative linguistics and cognitive psychology, which helped build some obvious strengths and weaknesses in both areas. With generative linguistics, we can see that some of the strengths are the power of explaining. It definitely goes into more of an explanation of why language learners are able to learn language quickly. It also provides some learning language predictions where we are able to predict certain grammar rules that might be easier or more difficult to learn. It also provides clear grammar rules, so it gives a more formal model. It focuses on internal grammar, which shows what people actually know, even if they're not saying things perfectly, and they're talking in a more social manner. And then another strength is a universal language and how it explains why languages have similarities in their patterns of their own language. Some weaknesses of generative linguistics are things like neglect of social interaction. Rothman and Slabakova explained that we know that sociology of language is a big variable that interacts with mental representation. And so a weakness is that we neglect the role of social interaction when it comes to generative linguistics. It also focuses a lot on the rules, so it ignores how the brain can process things differently than what maybe the rules may say. There's also a lack of understanding of learning differences, so it doesn't take into the account that not all learners are created equally and learn the same way. For the last slide, I want to talk about the strengths and weaknesses of cognitive psychology. First, we'll start with the strengths. One of the strengths of cognitive psychology is the fact that it focuses on cognitive processes, meaning how people pay attention, their working memory, and the practice of language. It also highlights the importance of practice and repetition, and how often we hear or see something can truly affect our learning and how much we're learning. Another strength is that it gives explanations of learning differences in a variety of learners, and the fact that we don't all learn the same way. It focuses on the process of learning, meaning that it's not about the end result, it's about how they got there. Lastly, it supports brain and learning research, giving connections to psychology and neuroscience. Now for the weaknesses. First, one of the weaknesses of cognitive psychology is that it gives more of descriptions instead of explanations, meaning that it always provides more of the how, but doesn't always give the why to things. It also focuses more on performance over competence, meaning that output is more important than internal knowledge. Cognitive psychology is based on studies and experiments, which is not the same as real-life learning that you may receive from classrooms and everyday life. And I believe Al-Ahmad said it best when he said he failed to consider the effect that a social setting and culture may have on cognitive development. Lastly, the cohesiveness of cognitive factors can also be a weak area because there are so many factors that play a role in learning, and it is hard to combine them all into one model like cognitive psychology.
Brown explains that a big part of cognitive psychology is how language learning connects to the way our brain works, especially our memory, attention, and problem solving skills. The first activity, memory practice, students can remember words by grouping them into topics. Like, for example, school words, which would be pencil, desk, notebook, teacher. When these words are connected by meaning, they are easier to recall. Our other activity is attention focused tasks. These help students notice important details while reading or listening. For example, we can highlight grammar or key vocabulary so they focus on the most important parts. Another activity is problem solving. Students figure out the meaning of a sentence from context or fix grammar mistakes. This helps them think more deeply about how language works. Another activity is think alouds, where students explain how they solved a problem or understood a sentence. This helps them become aware of their own thinking process. And finally, journal writing. Students can reflect on how they learned best or what grammar rules they've discovered. This helps them grow and become more independent learners. Basically, all these activities show that language learning is about how we think and process information, not just how we memorize it. These generative linguistic activities were found in the book we're reading, Principles of Language Learning and Teaching, and were also inspired by Noam Chomsky theory of generative grammar. Both Brown and Chomsky focus on how learners actively think about language and discover patterns instead of just memorizing rules. The first activity is find the rule. Instead of telling students the grammar rule, we give them a few examples and let them figure it out on their own. For example, they might notice that we add ed to make verbs past tense. This helps them discover patterns in a natural way. Next is sentence transformations. Students change sentences into different forms, like turning a present tense sentence into a past tense. This helps them see how structure changes while the meaning stays the same. Another activity is error correction. Students look at sentences with mistakes and fix them. This makes them think carefully about grammar rules and why something is correct or not. The last activity is compare and reflect. Students talk or write about how English grammar is similar or different to their first language. Brown explains that connecting new learning to what students already know helps it stick better. Overall, these activities show how students can discover and understand grammar through thinking and problem solving, which connects to both Brown ideas of cognitive learning and Chomsky theory that people are born with the ability to learn language.
Here, I'll share some insights from recent research in generative linguistics and cognitive psychology that are helpful for teachers. So, we'll just be talking about the science of this for a moment and how it relates to teaching. Recent brain imaging studies show that when people are learning a language, certain areas of the brain become active. And what these scans show is that we're naturally wired to notice and understand certain language rules and certain patterns. Because of this innate ability that we have, learners can start forming words, phrases, and sentences even right from the first exposure to a new language. So, for example, when a child hears a new language, their brain naturally looks for patterns, like how words change to form questions or how words change to be past tense. Even if the child doesn't understand every word, their memory holds on to these patterns long enough to figure out the rules. And that's why children can quickly start saying simple sentences like he runs or she ran, saying the words in the correct order, even when the language is new to them. They also learn to form questions by changing statements like, you are happy, into, are you happy? And these brain scans show that this process activates our prefrontal cortex. And what this does is just confirm that learning language involves active brain work. One of the key researchers in this, Angela Frederici, used MRI and PET scans to see what happens in the brain during language use. And she found that areas like the prefrontal cortex light up, and these parts of the brain help us remember words, they help us focus. Overall, they help us learn language. And this research just connects how we learn language with how our brain works. So when teachers know this, when teachers know that learners are naturally looking for patterns and that they're using their working memory to grasp language rules, teachers can then design lessons that support these processes. And this would make language learning easier and faster for all students. That said, there are some critics that offer different viewpoints on generative linguistics and cognitive psychology. Their ideas raise important points, especially when we're thinking about how these theories apply in real life. First, we have what are called usage-based theories, and these theories argue that we learn language mostly by using it often and noticing our patterns in everyday speech. So instead of relying on built-in grammar rules, or instead of relying on an innate ability to be able to see patterns in a language, our brains are actually picking up language through repeated exposure. And the more we hear and use certain phrases, the better we get at understanding and producing language. Then we also have emergentist theories that suggest that language develops naturally from our general brain abilities as we're interacting with the world. Language isn't something that's fixed inside of us from birth. Instead, it's something that's emerging through our learning experience and how our brain processes information. According to this view, language grows from how we think and how we communicate, not from an inborn set of rules. But both of these perspectives highlight the ongoing debate in language learning research and reminds us how complex language acquisition really is. So now to summarize, generative linguistics shows us that language learning is partly built into us, with universal grammar rules helping us learn quickly. And cognitive psychology focuses on the mental processes like attention and memory that support how we learn over time. And while generative linguistics explains fast learning and shared grammar patterns, it still doesn't fully address the social influences or individual differences. And cognitive psychology highlights these mental steps and brain connections, but sometimes misses the bigger picture of real world learning. Other theories remind us that using language often and learning through experience are also key parts of language development. And together, these views help us understand how language learning happens, whether it's through inborn rules or mental processes that help guide us along the way. Understanding these processes, though, will transform the way that we approach teaching and learning languages.